Hello, I'm Andrew Castle, and this is the latest offering from a rather unusual looking Wigtown Book Festival event. Our guest today is George Alagiah, an award-winning and distinguished foreign correspondent from the 90s and beyond, and in more recent years, of course, a regular figure on our television screens as he presents the main BBC News bulletins. We're here to talk about his debut novel, The Burning Land. It's a murder thriller set against the backdrop of political corruption in post-apartheid and post-Mandela South Africa. George, welcome.
Thank you very much, Andy. Good to see you.
And you, yes. It was a good book, loved it, really enjoyed it. It's a real page-turner.
Thank you for avoiding describing me as a veteran, which people are beginning to do.
Yes, well, I know the feeling. Yeah, no, it's a great book. Really enjoyed it, and there are lots of themes that we can talk about in due course. But I think what I found most remarkable, and many I think will find remarkable, is not just that you should plunge into the world of fiction after writing, as it were, straight books and being confined, if you like, to the straitjacket of news for so many years, but you did that in the midst of dealing with your own serious cancer issue. Where did you get the ambition, the strength to do that?
Well, this book was written, Andy, in kind of two halves. I'd started thinking about it before 2014, which is when I was diagnosed with cancer. And in fact, I think I'd written a couple of rough draft chapters and so on. And then, of course, got diagnosed, and I was very, very ill. Stage 4 bowel cancer. It had spread to other organs. There's no stage 5. It really looked bleak. So then actually nothing happened for, well, I think till about 2016 or thereabouts. And I then, I was in remission, and I thought, well, I'll pick it up again. But it was like starting all over again, because, the thing about fiction, in a way, unlike non-fiction, is that you're growing into characters, you're getting to know them as you go along. And I suddenly realized, I can't remember what Lindy, was going to do next, or how she felt about this. Lindy, by the way, is one of the central character, or one of the central characters in the book. So it was like starting again. And I think the answer to your question about, how do I find the determination, when you are told that you're closer to the end than you are to the beginning, if I can put it that way. It's a light bulb moment, and you just want to do those things. You feel enriched, actually, in many ways. Every single experience has meaning to it, and somehow I thought, well, I've always wanted to do this, to get into fiction, because I felt I could say things in fiction that I couldn't say as a journalist. And so I had a couple of years to do it, and I did it.
And you've been very open about your cancer. You've talked about it in public a lot. Did you find talking about it actually helped, or were you rather reticent at first to do so?
I was definitely, Annie, reticent at first. You can imagine, with my profile, several charities kind of got in touch with me when they heard that I was diagnosed with cancer, and this is 2014, 15, maybe even 16. And at that time, I really didn't feel comfortable. I mean, the thing is, cancer is a physical disease, but most of the challenges come in your head. And I had to sort all that out in my head, in how I was going to deal with it, how I was going to share it with my family, and so on. And the idea that I would then become some kind of advocate just seemed like the wrong thing to do. So I was reticent. And then I can't remember when, but a couple of years in, I thought about it, and I'd spoken to people, and they said, look, you do have a kind of access, and just that you're there 2 years on, talking about it will help people. I mean, the one thing I would say, Andy, is that, cancer is a very personal journey, and what's good for me isn't necessarily good for anybody else. There are as many as many ways of dealing with cancer as there are patients with cancer.
And I mean, you talk about reaching, I've heard you talk about reaching a place of contentment. Are you there now?
Absolutely, I am. That was what I was referring to in those first Oh, it was probably 6 months. I mean, there's the shock. You know, I was at the peak of my powers, as I thought, and this thing comes as completely out of the blue, and you go through all sorts of emotions. And I, in the end, decided, Andy, that the only way I could really kind of deal with this, I had to come up with almost a list of pros and cons, and I just literally jotted them down. And it turned out, when I looked at it, there were way more things in the pro column than in the cons. And I thought, well, this is a good life, actually, and as if I hadn't known it, but just it was a reminder. And then, yes, that kind of got me into this place of contentment, and I've stayed there happily, helped enormously by my family, my amazing wife, Fran, our boys, Matthew and Adam. And then the best thing of all is, a couple of years ago, we had a granddaughter, Mina, and she's just lit up my life. In fact, shortly after this, I've got a supper date with her.
Brilliant. And in terms of, so it's a journey you've been on, and I wonder what when you come to write the book, was that a help ultimately to having reached your place of contentment? You were happy to challenge it by getting into it. It's a skill, isn't it? I mean, as we've discussed already, I mean, actually writing for fiction is a tough thing to do.
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, in some ways, Andy, and you'll recognize this being a journalist. I mean, journalism it's given both of us, our careers, it's given us an insight into things. I mean, there are days, I'm sure you remember, when we seem to live more in that one day than most people live in a month, the things we see and witness. However, we are limited to the facts. And you kind of know, because people have told you or you sense it, there are things beyond the facts. And I'm not getting into fake news or all of that sort of nonsense, but there is a truth beyond the facts. I mean, we're in the business of marshalling our facts. And that's really what drove me to fiction, this idea that there were things I would have liked to have said as a journalist that were, more to do with motive. What drives a good person to turn bad? What drives, what enables a bad person to find redemption? Lust, prejudice, love, trust, all of these things are driving, and we don't really get into that in our work, So fiction opened up that door, if you like.
It was kind of, it gave you a journey into that. And in the book, the Burning Land, it starts, I thought, rather courageously, but also rather ominously, with a murder of the main character, in a sense. Tell us a bit about that, and I think you've got an extract there you could read.
I have. Yeah, so the story, let me just, if you don't mind, me kind of promoting it a little bit, there you go. So the story is essentially, it's called The Burning Land because, and this, by the way, is happening, and this is one of the stories I couldn't quite nail down as a journalist, but I know it's happening, and there are academic treatises and so on about it. But rich countries and rich people are, and have been, and are buying up great tracts of land in the poor world, either investment, as a kind of hedge against the future, climate change, for example, when people worry about whether they'll have enough land to grow food. China's involved in this, but you've got private businesses and so on. So that was it. And these deals are done often between the kind of rich people and the rich people in the poor countries. And of course, the people who may not have a little piece of paper, a title deed saying this is my land, because they and their ancestors roamed this land for centuries. They're the ones who get trampled on. So this book is about one such attempt to grab land and the opposition to it, and how that sets in motion a series of events which end up in great violence and conflagration in South Africa. I said it in South Africa. But as you say, so it starts off with the murder of a man called Lesedi Motlanthe. And let me describe the kind of man he was. Lesedi Motlanthe's murder was one of those pivotal moments that seemed destined to change the course of a country's trajectory. There are some events, a law passed, a speech delivered, a transgression exposed, which are deemed significant only in retrospect, like looking back on a life and realizing the point at which things had taken a turn for the better or the worse. This was different. As news of the murder spread across South Africa, its people knew there could be no going back to business as usual. Lesedi Motlanshi was more than a man. He was an idea, a symbol, and with his death, that idea had been tarnished. Lesedi had been one of freedom's children, born in the 80s. His life mirrored the changes in South Africa as apartheid's pernicious laws were expunged from the statutes. A quick and confident boy, he'd once been interviewed by a TV crew doing a piece on the role schools were playing in changing attitudes to race. The reporter had asked a class of teenagers to define racism. In a flash, Lesedi stuck up his hand. He'd pointed to one of only 3 white children in the class and said, well, racism is like, if I'm unkind to Darren and call him names, Whitey and so on. The clip had made it onto the evening news, this reversal of the conventional definition of racism that white people could be victims too, from the lips of a black child, seemed to speak volumes to the miraculous journey South Africa was making. And now he was dead. Even in a country inured to violent crime and a murder rate that saw it perpetually leading the wrong kind of international league table, the notion that Lesedi Motlanshi would one day become a victim, another notch on the grim statistics board, was unthinkable. There wasn't a person in the country, whether they spent their time in a township shebeen or in a gated mansion, who did not know who Lesedi Motlanshi was and what he represented. So, who in their right mind would want him dead?
And of course, events spiral from there. But this land issue, I guess we're used to hearing about how under apartheid, it was white farmers who had the best land. I guess the assumption was that the land would somehow go back to those who were on it and worked it. What is it about land that seems to be so incendiary in South Africa and across that continent?
Well, I don't know what it's like up in Scotland, Andy. I'm on a farm actually right now in Cornwall. In the countryside, I think people still here in urban Britain, we're an urban country, have a kind of relationship with the land. But for the most part, most people like me, city folk, have a transactional relationship. The nearest we come to it is a mortgage, and we buy a piece of land or buy a house, and that's it. Now, in the rest of the world, in the majority world, in the poor world, if I can call it that, land is a part of identity. It is who you are. You buried your fathers, your mothers, your grandfathers in the soil that you continue to work. And that's why it is such a crucial issue. That's why, whether it was in Kenya or in Zimbabwe or in South Africa, and the same, by the way, in South America and Asia, land is often what colonialism and the fight against it and so on was. And yes, the great promise of freedom was that the land would be, I think the Freedom Charter, I can't remember the words exactly, but land was a central issue. It was how South Africa, the ANC, the African National Congress, had kind of defined freedom. And it hasn't turned out that way. Now, the reasons are various, but in Zimbabwe, we saw forced land transactions. People were just thrown off the land. But who got the land? It was the rich people. And much the same thing, I think, is happening elsewhere in the world. I could have set this book, by the way, in other African countries. I could have said it in South America, Asia. I know South Africa, which is why I set it there. And
who is doing the buying? And is it widespread? Is it states? Is it private equity firms out to make money? Who's doing it?
It's all of those things, Andy. All of those things. I think. If you talk about state, in a sense, there's quite a lot of talk about the way in which China has its eyes on land in Africa, and indeed lots of the sort of the so-called loans and deals that go on between Chinese governments and African governments are often centered around patches of land. And in the country of my birth, Sri Lanka, for example, there's a couple of parts of Colombo which has sort of been bequeathed to the Chinese for decades. But it is business as well, because as a hedge against, as I said, things like climate change. That's definitely going to happen. I think there are going to be parts of the world that grow food now that can't, and they want somewhere some insurance to feed their people.
And do you feel that this is kind of finishing that unfinished business? I mean, all the stuff you've talked about, was it just impossible to get the kind of confirmation that an impartial journalist requires to put that on, you know, a broadcaster like the BBC? And have you achieved that?
I came close to it. And by the way, when I say me, you know, it was, as you know, in television especially, and radio, you know, there are producers who are as good, if not better, journalists than those of us who appear in front of the camera. And we talked about it, a group of us, doing it. And a couple of times we came close, got turned away. There was one attempt we had in Kenya. It is going on in South Sudan. I mean, there's a lot of, as I say, academic stuff. By the way, if you go on the EU website, certainly when I was researching this book, or even last year I checked up, if you go on the EU website, I can't remember, I think it might be on agriculture, but there are references to this, to land being taken over. So all sorts of organizations and people are getting involved in this.
And there's another theme which comes up and is quite prominent in the book as you relate the story and the consequences of the efforts to kind of prevent this sale of land to foreigners. And that is a kind of suspicion, a hatred almost of migrants. And it fascinated me because your association with Africa in particular began as a migrant, and indeed, I suppose, the UK.
Absolutely. I mean, I do say I've been a migrant twice over. My family left Ceylon, as it was then, in the 60s, 61, in fact, very early 60s. We left because already it was obvious to my parents' generation of Tamils, we're Tamils, that they just felt Sri Lanka wasn't going to be the kind of place that we would prosper, and they left. And actually that was prompted slightly, and you may recognize some of the scenes in this book. It was prompted by some violence in 1958, where there were riots. Tamils were dragged out of public transport. If you couldn't speak, you know, the majority language well, then you just got beaten up and so on. My father, who worked right across town from where we lived in a more Tamil area, you know, he had to be bundled into a car, hiding there with a group of Sinhalese friends. I mean, of course, you know, this was a kind of political thing. Actually, people were rubbing along quite nicely up to that point, Sinhalese and Tamils. And so that convinced him that certainly, I don't think, you know, even if he and my mother could have survived it and somehow made a living for themselves, they certainly didn't want it for us, their children, myself and 4 sisters. So they got out. And I mean, the weird thing is, for me, Africa is represented a land of opportunity, because that was kind of, even as a child, I think I kind of understood that our life was going to be better having gone to Africa. So it was slightly strange, actually, that by the time I went back to the continent as a professional, as a reporter, things had changed. It was no longer a land of opportunity, not just for migrants, but for the tens and hundreds of millions of people who had born and grown up there.
And of course, there's that section in the book which deals specifically with that. It's an experience that one of the protagonists, the charity worker, she experiences. I think you've got a passage you can read on that.
And the thing to say about this, I don't know about you, Andy. I mean, I often get asked, you know, what's the one lesson you learned from your years as a reporter? And for me, I'd say it is that this thing that we call civilization is kind of paper thin. It really doesn't take much to kind of strip it away, and then suddenly there's kind of chaos and so on. So I kind of wanted to delve into that. And of course, in those situations, you know, all bets are off, and suddenly foreigners become enemies. And that's what happens in the Burning Land. The police need to explain very quickly how such a rich, symbolic person, iconic person from a big family in South Africa gets murdered. So they immediately just point the finger at a Mozambican, which South Africa is the richest country in the region. So it's a bit like, you know, Britain or Germany or whatever. It attracts migrants, and there are lots of Mozambicans, Zimbabweans, even people from West Africa there. And so when the police arrest a Mozambican for the murder of Lesedi Motlanshi, it unleashes a bout of xenophobia. So this once civilized country suddenly begins to look very, very different. And Lindy Seaton, who's a character in this book, she's born to white exiles, South African exiles living in London. She works for a conflict resolution organization called South Trust, and she's sent to South Africa to try to mediate. And she's talking to a shopkeeper, and he says, "Oh, don't worry, ma'am, we're going to send them back," i.e. the Mozambicans. And she's walking back away from the shop, and this is what she's thinking. How many times in how many different countries and in how many different languages have those words, "send them back," been used? And how many people around the world had heard them and been terrified by what they meant? Those three words robbed them of their identities as individuals, as families and neighbors, even as friends. Them, not us. Them over there. Search them, catch them, arrest them, deport them, kill them. That was all it took. Shift the people from the column marked us to the one marked them, and everything became possible, justifiable.
It's quite a powerful piece in the book, because it's something, even with someone who doesn't have direct experience of South Africa, which I don't, it resonates with the kind of situations you're seeing all over the world at this time. There's always, as you say, in a so-called civilized society, what makes us want to suddenly point at
the other? And you know, this happens. I mean, this is what racism is about. You know, I'm always never sure, you know, whether I'm a victim of racism, but I discovered that I'm a different color to you, Andy. I didn't know I was, but I found out at age 11 when I was sent to Britain to boarding school, and found out well, if you don't mind, let me talk about it. I mean, I went to boarding school. In those days, you know, it was communal showers and all that kind of thing, and you know, the big guys got the hot water first, and everybody else sort of.
That's a familiar tale, yes.
got what was left. Anyway, and I think you got a shower about twice a week or 3 times a week or something ridiculous. So there am I in the first week. You know, I have left Ghana and a backyard that had mango trees, guava trees, pineapple bushes, papaya trees, rabbits, chickens, a dog, my parents, everything, to it's a direct grant school. So that's a bit like a grammar school here now. Anyway, so there we are, sort of cumulative shower, and I get into the shower. And remember, this is September, the first term of the year. All the white kids have been on holiday and whatever, running around, and you know, and so they all had tan lines where they, you know, where their swimming trunks have been. I, of course, don't have that, because not least because people like me are sensible and we don't hang around in the sun and get burned. Anyway, so we started the shower, and then one boy just turns around to me and said, you know, why haven't you got a tan line? And this just became a refrain. Everybody saying, "Why don't you have a tan?" And that was the first moment, honestly, that I thought, well, oh, this is about my colour. And then one of the kids, who later became a good friend, by the way, turned around and he had the punchline. He said, "Oh," pointing at me, he said, "You know, in bongo land, they don't wear any clothes, and they get a tan all over. That's why, you know, George is brown." And the whole shower room started erupting. I mean, inside, I was absolutely seething. I felt small. I felt vulnerable. I'm on my own. You couldn't pick up. There are no mobile phones or anything. I felt terrible. And what really gets me to this day is I was thinking, what do I do? So I pretended to get the joke. And I laughed. I laughed at myself.
The urge to fit in.
Yeah, I laughed myself. And that day, I kind of said to myself, you know what? It's not, I mean, in a childish way, I think I said to myself, I'm never going to let colour be the thing that defines me. It's going to have to be, you know, in the classroom, maybe, in the athletics track, whatever. And as you just said, you know, I fitted in. Now, maybe that's not.
And that can't have been, though, George. I mean, maybe an early experience. It can't have been the only issue you've come across. And I wonder if, in your professional career, once you felt that you'd kind of fitted in, you'd assimilated, as it were, you still suffered from that racism.
And part of the answer is I don't know. I mean, I applied to the BBC quite a few times actually before I got in. You know, who knows? And I got in because it was the first time I was offered an interview. But you know, so who knows? Why didn't I get an interview? You know, I knew people from the university I was at who got into the trainee schemes. I don't know is the answer. I mean, to be honest, I think professionally, in the BBC, I can't point to that and say, no, I was a victim of racism. What I mean, talking more broadly at the BBC, I mean, I think there's a job of work to be done. I think Tony Hall, our last Director General, acknowledged it, and our new Director General acknowledged it. And, you know, people, this thing about, you know, is an organisation, institution racist and so on, lots of all kinds of labels. And I think in some ways, it doesn't matter what you call it. The question is, can you put more people of colour on desks in front of cameras? More importantly, by the way, Andy, behind the camera. You know, I mean, at the moment, you know, you look at people, I mean, I present Britain's most watched news programme. Well, that's not a bad gig. And, you know, I'm a migrant.
And you're not alone. There are quite a few
exactly.
Black and Asian BAME presenters now.
Exactly. But so the issue really is, and it's one recognised in the BBC, as I say, but not without, by the way, some pressure from Black and minority ethnic staff. It's where the decisions get made about scheduling, about commissioning, about how the money is spent and so on. In those areas, unseen, away from the cameras, there aren't enough people. So there's a job of work to be done.
It's not as if you're just saying that. I mean, I noticed from the BBC's annual report this very week, it was saying that, you know, it's the BBC's target of getting 15% of BAME representatives in leadership positions. They had failed to meet that. So, you know, they're aware of it.
Absolutely. As I say, and that's why, you know, what there's been is a gap between what people have wanted to do and what they've been able to deliver. And I think there's a recognition that really we can't have another 5 years or something. And I'm looking to someone like Tim Day, who gets it, by the way, you know.
Mm. And what do you make, though? I mean, you present the news. What do you make when you're presenting the news about Black Lives Matter? You see the kind of incidents that are going on in the States. You see, you know, similar kind of claims of racism here in the UK as well. What do you make of that as you say, a double migrant, someone who's been through all this?
Well, I mean, I think this is a very interesting question, quite a complex one, Andy. And the bottom line is, as a BBC journalist, well, as a presenter, actually, and there's a difference between being a reporter and a presenter. As a presenter, I hold that space, you know, where I sit at the news at 6, I hold that space for every single person who's watching the news at 6, whether they're on the left or the right, whether they're a man, a woman, whether they're migrant or not. And so I think I've been very careful, and it's not been, it's sometimes challenging, given what I see on the screen, and I have to look up and continue with the next story. Oh, how I'd love to say something, but I think it's really, really important, actually. The BBC is paid for by virtually every household in the country. It is a universal service, and that means people need to be able to trust people like me, that I am able to leave my own opinions and to curate the news with my colleagues in a way that is really just about trying to make a judgment about what is important to the millions and millions of people who watch us.
So work to be done. I was just wondering, coming back to the book, we've talked about the migrant issue, but there's another theme which is also fascinating, particularly to people who have not been and lived and worked in South Africa, and that is that the way things have changed, so or turned out in such a different manner to what we were expecting. You know, Mandela has gone now, and the South Africa we expected under Mandela is not the South Africa we're getting. Now, you lived and reported on that. Is that something that has surprised you as much as it surprised other people?
It surprised is the right word, Andy. I suppose, and by the way, I was not alone. I mean, my great friend of mine, and someone you'll know, I'm sure, and probably a friend of yours, Alan Little, we both covered that period. Would we be surprised? Probably we would, if it took us to a quiet corner in those days and said, do you think this is going to last? We might have said, you know, maybe not. But I think both of us, well, perhaps I won't speak for Alan, I'll speak for myself. I think both of us wanted it to succeed, just like so many millions of South Africans, not least because both Alan and I had traveled around Africa and seen the thing not working, and somehow we thought South Africa could be different. I mean, part of that is a kind of emotional response, you know, a response to this towering figure, towering figure of morality, Nelson Mandela. but part of it also actually because the struggle for freedom in South Africa had gone on so long that it had created a really powerful civic society, and we kind of thought that would make the difference. Alas, it didn't.
Sorry to interrupt, but you could not have envisaged, could you? With Mandela and all that he did when he got into government, that there would be this gulf between a white elite would simply be replaced by a black elite, and the poor would stay poor.
Well, the replacing by black elite in a way, that's what freedom is about. Freedom can be a pretty ugly thing. And I mean, the book tackles this actually because Lindy, the character at one point, appears to make a judgment and saying, oh, somehow if you've got a black capitalist who's kind of bursting with money, something that's bad. Oh, but it was okay when white people did it. So, I mean, it's not so much about that there is a black elite, but that given the history of that country, that they should have done so little with the newfound powers and economic status they got. And that's really what, the burning at the heart of it is that. And, it got to a stage where in South Africa, they gave it a label. It was called state capture. I think some academics wrote it. Literally, the state was captured by a group of people, powerful black business people, the politicians, and an outside family, actually, as it turned out, an Indian family, who had an enormous influence on both the politicians and the business elite.
And I mean, in terms of what we see, though, we still see, don't we, townships, we see chaos and all that, all of which I, for one, I speak personally, but I thought, well, somehow Mandela is such a great figure that this would have at least partly disappeared, and yet it stays there. And is it true, I'm told some people, there are some youngsters, some people, some generations in South Africa who barely remember his name?
Andy, you're absolutely right. I'm not sure where you got that, but yes, you're right. I mean, I haven't seen this, by the way, firsthand, but I'm obviously in touch with lots of people in South Africa still. And yes, I mean, remember, Nelson Mandela was released. We all remember James Robbins kind of reporting on and so on in 1990. So that's 30 years ago. That's quite a long time. A lot of people who've been born, after he left the presidency. And yes, there are people, apparently young people, saying, what did that guy Mandela ever do for us? And the thing is, I think Mandela framed his presidency in a particular way. He felt, honestly, I think, I'm sure it was honest, and I think correctly, that reconciliation was hugely important for that country. I mean, there had been, the murder of this chap, for example, I mean, among many, but Chris Hani, very powerful, charismatic figure in the liberation movement, had been murdered by a white person, as it turned out, a foreigner. But it was a country ready to burst, and Mandela felt that was his job, to bring people together. And in a sense, what happened was all the economic inequality seemed to just disappear, because he just by force of character made both sides, black and white, feel good about themselves. And I assume anyway, that he expected that the rest of it would come afterwards. I mean, this man was a radical at heart, let's not forget it. We sort of think of him as this rather old, avuncular kind of figure, but he was a radical. He was a hard man. I mean, he invented the armed struggle, if you like. And it's the people who came after him who didn't quite deliver on the economic reforms. I mean, they're trying, but it's not yet. As you say, the townships are still there. There's lots of people without water, lots of people without electricity. There's millions who have water and electricity that didn't have it, by the way. We journalists aren't incredibly, not very good at going and telling their story sometimes.
No, we don't like good news. But I was just, was there a choice? Is there a choice still? Is it still, I mean, the book gives the impression that, land is still this boiling issue, and that the inequalities are still pretty much a powder keg. That's what I got from it. Is there still a route out of this which can avoid that?
Yeah, yes, there is. And I think land is an issue. And by the way, it's being politicized in ways in which we didn't see even 10 years ago. And there are political parties and groups that are making the center of their pitch to the people. In fact, the African National Congress, the ANC, which has been in power ever since 1994, they've actually made some constitutional changes that appear to make it possible that land could be taken away from those. And I think we need to sort of, those of us who've kind of been around and seen these things a couple of times, we need to look at where else this has happened. Kenya and Zimbabwe in particular. You cannot have, in my opinion, I said I was going to give you opinions, but I'm going to give you one on this. You can't have, Tim Davies not listening. You cannot have it. That's our Director General, for those who don't know.
It'll stay in Wigtown, don't worry.
Don't tell anybody, shush. You cannot have a situation where not just the land, but most of the best land is owned by a minority. It just won't work. It didn't work in Zimbabwe. I reported on it, and the way Mugabe went about it was terrible. It was violent. It was venal, and it was illegal more than anything else. But it does beg a question: do white landowners get it? Do they understand? And that's what this book is. Those who feel most secure, I think this is, I'm quoting from The Burning Land, I hope I've got it right. Those who feel secure are those who walk on soil they can call their own. Do the white farmers get it? Now, in places like South Africa, there are some exceptionally enlightened white farmers, landowners, who've already begun to share their land in various ways, come up with deals, hand over a bit of their farm or offer themselves as consultants to small black farmers and so on. But it takes two to tango. And if you don't move quickly, at some point, it just becomes a very easy issue to politicize. And then you end up with the kinds of things, the Mama Rebellion in Kenya or what you saw in Zimbabwe. And
in the book itself, there's quite a powerful, almost nostalgic bit from one of the central character. Do you want to read that? And that gives us an idea of what perhaps it should have been.
Yeah. So what happens is you've heard me talk about Lindy Seaton, who comes over to South Africa as a conflict resolution, and she meets up with an old family friend, Kahiso, this man Kahiso, and together he's working with the rural poor. That's his job. He runs a little NGO, an organization, a charity that tries to help the rural poor, whether it is to establish links with white farmers and so on, just to kind of get the progress that freedom seemed to offer. Anyway, he gets caught, Lindy and Kahiso get caught in this. They end up in the middle of the heart of this violence. They kind of had days to just not just save the country, but save themselves. And he's been involved in resistance to some of this land grab, and he suddenly realizes he has a sense of doubt. How did I unleash all of this? What happened? And he starts thinking back to more gentler, to kinder times, and that's what this passage is about. And we're talking about Kahiso here. He remembered the time when he'd helped to organize an end-of-harvest braai, South Africa's version of a barbecue, on a farm right on the border with Mozambique. It was the first year of a profit-sharing scheme that Kahiso had helped put together. The area had been blessed with good rains and a bountiful crop. That evening, as a blood-orange sky had turned purple, as shadows grew longer and fainter till they just seeped away into the soil, one of the migrant workers had brought out his mbira, a traditional handheld musical instrument, a finger piano, as some called it. Kahiso had sat on the edge of the group, entranced by this vision of a different future. The farmer and his wife, Afrikaners both, sat near the fire. On the other side of the circle, their children huddled next to the housemaid and some of the workers' children. An old man, rheumy eyes staring into the embers, pulled out a zol, a homemade cigarette spiced with the comforting fragrance of dacha. Women spread polyester blankets over their bare legs, and young men shared the last few bottles of beer. calloused thumbs plucked at the metal tines of the mbira, shaped like the flat handles of tablespoons, and picked out a tune that had been written in another century in the great language of the coast, Swahili. Nobody quite understood the words, but all were moved by the ballad, the lament of a young suitor who knows he will not wed his angel, his Malaika, for want of a good fortune. Kahiso had looked across at the farmer and was sure he'd seen the man's eyes well up with a tenderness so far removed from the caricature of his people. The morning, he knew, would expose again the starkness of his country's struggle to find a middle ground between great wealth and great poverty. But for that evening, under that deep and star-studded African sky, Kahiso let himself dream. Yes, dream of another country, one in which hope triumphed over despair and idealism scored a victory over cynicism.
I want to move on to something I was quite struck by also reading in the book. The themes are there, we discussed some of them, and there are plenty of others too, but it was the characters. First of all, how did you find getting those characters fleshed out, if you like, given this was your first foray into fiction? And secondly, I noticed that some of the all the strongest characters, I think, are actually women. Was that a deliberate, conscious decision?
The only conscious decision actually was I always knew that the main character, if you like, were the two characters, Kahiso and Lindy. And I knew one would be black and Lindy would be white, and I knew she was going to be a woman. The others, no, they unfolded as I wrote this story. I mean, I kind of knew where I wanted to start, and I kind of knew where I wanted to end, but the middle just grew on me. And look, some people might say, well, it shows, you know.
Not at all, not at all. But I mean, I noticed like that as the story develops, the key players who try to help, in effect, and play a pivotal role are Lesidi's mother for a start, and another woman who helps from a cafe, and they kind of have that strength and that conviction that I associate with the kind of women that I've seen depicted on the news elsewhere in Africa.
I think they came from my experience as a reporter. I mean, remember before the BBC, I'd been a reporter in print journalism as a foreign correspondent, and I'd traveled around Africa a lot. And so much of the time, the burden of growing the crops, of looking after children falls on women. And I have seen, you know, a strength of character that actually men or women here in our rich and comfortable country, we never get asked to sort of even find that kind of strength, whereas there are women having to do it day by day, daily in Africa. So that, okay, the bedrock. There's a kind of and a wonderful beauty about these women. You know, they're not kind of the beauty sort of shines through in their character and so on. It's not about you know, what you wear or how, you know, and so on. And I was trying to get at that really. And so, but Ma Katiwe, who's a cafe owner, who Kahiso knows, and Lesedi, the murdered man's mother, they're in a way an amalgam of all these women. But Lesedi's mother in particular is, I think, really a tribute to the great South African women in the struggle, people like Albertina Sisulu in particular. And these are, and Winnie Mandela, you know, although she kind of got a fame as a politician, whereas some of these other women kind of did the work and never quite. I mean, those who knew them and knew about the struggle kind of knew how influential and important they were, but they didn't necessarily get the recognition of the Oliver Tambos, the Nelson Mandelas, the Joe Slovers, and so on. And these, I really model them on that, on these women, and I'm happy about that. The other thing you asked, you know, why women? It happened, but you know, I grew up in a house full of women. I had 4 sisters, and they're all, you know, they're all brighter than me. You know, so I you know, there's never any question in my family that, you know, that somehow women are weak or or unable to do things. I mean, my sisters are amazing women. They each carved out, different ways of living out their lives. And so it just wasn't an issue. And it just happened. I mean, honestly, as I say,
given that view, I just wonder what you make of all the, well, certainly the BBC's, but the travails over gender recognition there in salaries and things like that, because obviously that's the world you now inhabit.
Yeah, and look, it's not a BBC problem. We know that.
No.
No. Just look at where the whole Me Too movement started, and things are catching up with reality. I mean, all of us in our private lives, and none of us bring up our daughters any different to our. I mean, I only had boys, but our sons, and somehow when we get into the workplace, all these inequalities start happening, and I'm so happy that this is getting sorted out, and well, I mean, you almost don't need to discuss it, because it's so obvious that there is inequality there, isn't there? I mean, it's ridiculous, really.
The other thing I was going to ask you a little bit about is the violence. There's a bit of violence in the book. It's quite graphic. Did you feel the need to put that in, or is this based on the events perhaps you've seen reporting, not just from South Africa, but obviously right across the continent?
Well, I mean, there are scenes of violence. I mean, by my count, I mean 3. I think that I and certainly 2 of them, I did think quite carefully, Andy, about how I should write them, how descriptive I should be, and well, I just felt, it's like kind of showing shots of a war and only seeing the kind of shell bursting out of the barrel, and then showing consequences, which I've never been a very great fan of, actually, because war it's ugly, it's painful, it's blood, it's gore. So anyway, I don't want to put people off the book. I mean, the book isn't suffused with violence, but as you say, there are episodes. All I can say in my defense, Andy, is that I wasn't making this up. Everything that's in the book, in one way or another, at one time, I have seen, I've witnessed, and okay, not in one place altogether, but I've sort of drawn these experiences. So it's not made up. As I said earlier, it doesn't take much for our world to turn ugly, and I was really trying to get into that. And so no, in the end, I did, as I said, I thought carefully, but I don't apologise for their inclusion in those passages. They're not huge, they're not long, but there are.
No, they're not. It was just more, it was just the actual events that took place, and I guess they would be based on real life, but they're quite shocking, but they don't overshadow the book. But I just wondered if that was something that had detained you as you were looking at putting
well,
them
I
in.
certainly thought about it, as I say, but I think I would have been selling readers short, actually, if you kind of massage that kind of thing.
It's almost that. I remember Martin Bell, our distinguished colleagues, talking about, it's all very well, saving our audiences from the worst of war, but is it always the right thing to do? Sometimes you need to know the kind of violence that goes on.
Every time I think, I don't know if you've heard this story about Martin. I don't know how you did it, but when I started off, just so our audience knows, in television, it's 3 words a second. So I sit in my notebook and I used to write little columns, 3 words a second, so I'd know, roughly how long I was, the pictures were and how much I had to write. Until Martin Bell never wrote a thing, actually. He used to look at the pictures. The editor would show him, right, we've got this sequence and this sequence and this sequence. And then apparently he'd sort of walk around the tent or the caravan or wherever they were, and they'd come back and just boom, he'd extemporize. Have you heard that?
Yes, in fact, I watched him do it in Belfast. He really unnerved one of our picture editors, because I warned the picture editor. I said, you realise, Martin, I'd met him in Washington beforehand, and said, you realise Martin doesn't write things down, so you will have to be ready to press those buttons when he comes in, because once it's in his head, it comes out. And he said, oh, yeah, I'll be fine. When he came out afterwards, it was a changed man, because it really does put a discipline.
I don't think anyone ever has done that, but what a great hero.
Yeah. But I mean, and I always enjoyed his viewpoints. I remember there was a great story someone told me about the Martin Bell approach actually to that was the details are in the queue. Here comes the piece. It's 1 minute 40. So there we are. But yeah, no, I just wonder about that. I just wonder now, you know, you've written one novel. You are a novelist. Are there more to come? If so, what are the kind of areas that you might want to get into in the future?
I would like to write something based in Sri Lanka. You know, I left there as a child, 5 years old, and it was very interesting. When I finally went back there, I think it was about 27 years, after a gap of 27 years, there was a kind of, and I wasn't ready for this, by the way, Andy, you know, by that time I'd sort of convinced myself and everybody else that I was British, you know, and
I think that's the title of your first book, isn't it? From immigrant to Englishman. Yeah. Immigrant boy to Englishman, yes.
I'd done that, and I'd shoved all my Sri Lankan heritage, culture, in a sort of attic in my mind. Anyway, there was a kind of absolute umbilical connection with this land. I mean, the minute I got off the plane, the smells, the heat, the cooking, the language, even some of the words. I mean, I found myself saying to my wife, you know, we met at Durham at uni, and so I said, "My God, do you realise you're speaking Tamil?" I mean, it's appalling Tamil, nobody can understand me. But nonetheless, you know, so there is a connection there, and I've spent so much of my adult life, as I say, actually sidelining it simply because of the pressure, and we're getting back to the whole race thing. The pressure of having to fit in meant, in my case, I'm not saying it's the right thing to have done, but this is how it happened. I felt I had no choice. I kind of sidelined my Sri Lankan culture. So something around that would be great. I haven't got a plot idea, but that's where I would like it to be. And it needn't be fiction; it could be non-fiction. Yeah, I think that's what it would be lovely to do, something like that. Watch this space.
Certainly, and we'll look forward to it because, as I say, The Burning Land, which is your latest novel, fantastic book. Thank you indeed for sparing the time to talk to our audience at Wigtown Book Festival. Thank you very much indeed, George. And I would just say, as an aside, before we go to the audience that are tuning into these on YouTube, it is free, obviously, but given the nature of what we're living through at the minute, any donations will, of course, be gratefully received. In the meantime, George, all it leaves me to say is thank you very much indeed. Such a pleasure to catch up. Such a good book. Really love it. I would encourage people to get it. Thank you very much for joining us.
Andy, it's been my pleasure too. And I hope we didn't sound like two old kind of duffers.
Always a danger.
But it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, and thank you to the Wigtown Festival.